Some people don't raise their voices because they're waiting to see who deserves to hear them. The glass didn't shatter loudly. It slipped, hit the edge of the table, and rolled onto the polished floor with a soft, hollow sound that somehow carried farther than it should have. Conversations paused. Forks hovered midair. And for a brief second, the entire restaurant seemed to breathe in at once. Emily Carter stood still, her hand suspended just above the empty space where the glass had been. Her fingers trembled, barely noticeable, unless you were looking for it. No one was. Not really. They were looking at her, but not seeing her. A quiet waitress in a pressed white shirt and black apron. Early 20s. Blonde hair pulled back neatly. The kind of person people assumed they understood in a single glance. Careful, one of the men at table 12 said, his voice carrying just enough to invite laughter. These things aren't cheap. A few chuckles followed. Not loud. Not cruel enough to be called out. Just enough to land. Emily bent down, picked up the glass carefully, and set it back on the tray.
No apology.
No defense. Just a small nod, as if acknowledging gravity itself. The man leaned back in his chair, smirking. You should probably leave the expensive stuff to people who know what they're doing. This time, the laughter came easier. Someone lifted a phone. Not obvious. Just angled enough.
Recording, maybe.
Or pretending to. It didn't matter. The message was the same. Emily's grip tightened around the edge of the tray. Her knuckles turned pale, then slowly relaxed. When she spoke, her voice was even. I'll bring you a replacement right away, sir. No edge.
No sarcasm. Just calm. Too calm.
At the far end of the room, near the window where the city lights blurred into soft gold streaks against the glass, a man sat alone. Daniel Whitmore. Navy suit. Silver watch catching the light each time his wrist shifted slightly. He hadn't looked up when the glass fell. Hadn't reacted when the laughter spread. But his eyes, they had moved. Just once. From his untouched drink to Emily's hands. Then back again.
As if noting something.
Filing it away. The manager appeared moments later, drawn by the subtle tension that only experienced eyes could detect. His smile was practiced.
Polished.
Is everything all right here? The man at table 12 gestured toward Emily without even looking at her. Your waitress nearly ruined our table. Might want to train your staff better. The manager's smile tightened. Just slightly. He turned to Emily. Why don't you apologize, Emily? A pause.
Small.
Almost invisible. Emily looked at him. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just steady. I didn't spill anything on the table, she said quietly. The room shifted. Not louder. Not softer. Just different. The manager's expression hardened, the kind of change that only someone paying attention would catch. That's not the point, he replied under his breath. Just apologize. Emily's fingers curled slightly against the tray again, then stilled. Around them, eyes lingered, waiting, watching, judging. Somewhere in the background, a chair scraped lightly against the floor. Not abrupt, not aggressive, just enough to exist. Daniel Whitmore set his glass down. For the first time since he walked in, he looked up. And this time, he didn't look away. Daniel Whitmore did not move immediately, and that was what made it unsettling, because power did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it revealed itself in stillness, in the way a man could choose not to react while everyone else rushed to fill the silence. And for a moment longer, he simply watched, his gaze steady, measured. As if the entire room had become a quiet equation he was solving piece by piece. Emily stood where she was, tray balanced against her palm, posture straight. Breathing even, not challenging, not retreating, just present, and that presence seemed to irritate the man at table 12 more than any apology ever could. See, that is the problem, the man said, leaning forward slightly, his voice edged with amusement that felt rehearsed. No accountability. That is what happens when standards drop. A few nods followed, a few soft laughs, the kind people gave when they wanted to belong to the louder side of the room. The manager exhaled slowly. Patience. Thinning behind a polite mask. Emily, he said again, more firmly this time, just say you are sorry and we can move on. There it was, the simple exit, the expected script, the moment where most people would bend just enough to make the discomfort disappear. Emily lowered her eyes for a fraction of a second, not in defeat, but in thought. Then she looked back up, her voice still quiet, still controlled. "I am sorry you feel that way." The sentence landed differently, softer in tone, heavier in meaning. The table went still for half a beat before the reaction came, a sharper laugh now, less friendly, more pointed. "Did you hear that?" One of the men said, glancing around as if inviting witnesses. "That is not an apology, that is attitude." The phone tilted slightly higher, no longer pretending. The manager's jaw tightened. "That is enough," he said under his breath, stepping closer to Emily. "You are representing this restaurant, not yourself." Emily did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply held her ground in a way that did not ask for permission, and across the room, Daniel's fingers tapped once against the side of his glass, a small, almost absent gesture, but his eyes had not left her, not since the moment she chose her words carefully instead of conveniently. The room began to divide in invisible lines, some watching with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. A few already losing interest now that the tension was no longer entertaining but uncomfortable, and that was when Daniel finally shifted in his seat. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the chair beneath him to slide back an inch against the floor. The sound was soft, but in a room that had learned to listen, it was enough. His hand reached for the check holder on his table. Not because he was leaving, but because he was noticing something. The name written neatly at the bottom of the receipt, Emily Carter. His eyes lingered there for a second longer than necessary, then lifted again, returning to the scene unfolding just a few tables away, as if something had aligned, not yet spoken, not yet revealed, but inevitable all the same. And for the first time that night, the silence in the room did not belong to the crowd, it belonged to him. The manager's patience snapped in a way that was almost invisible, a slight tightening around his eyes. A breath held just a fraction too long before he spoke again. "Emily, step aside for a moment." His voice low, controlled, but no longer polite, the kind of tone that did not invite discussion. Emily did not argue. She shifted her weight, taking a small step back, not retreating, simply creating space, her tray still balanced, her posture unchanged, and for a moment it looked as if the situation would dissolve the way most uncomfortable moments did, quietly, without resolution, swept under the routine of service and noise. But the man at table 12 was not finished. "No, no," he said, raising a hand slightly as if stopping a performance mid-act. "Let us not move on so quickly." His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I think we deserve proper service, do we not?" The others at the table murmured in agreement, some amused, some uneasy, but none stepping away, because it was easier to stay seated than to stand against anything. "Perhaps," the man continued, leaning back in his chair with casual authority, "she can start over, introduce herself again, properly this time." A few soft laughs followed, less confident now, but still present. The manager hesitated, caught between protecting the restaurant's image and ending the scene before it escalated further, and in that hesitation, the room stretched, thin and fragile. Emily inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadied more than lungs. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, not lingering, not pleading, simply acknowledging, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Good evening, my name is Emily, and I will be taking care of your table tonight." The words were perfect, measured, exactly what was expected, and yet something about them felt different, as if they were no longer offered for approval, but simply stated as fact. The man tilted his head, studying her for a second, then gave a short, dismissive nod. "Better," he said, though the word carried no real satisfaction, just a need to conclude his own performance. The tension should have ended there. It should have dissolved into the background noise of clinking glasses and low conversations, but it did not, because across the room, Daniel Whitmore had already made his decision. He closed the check holder slowly, his thumb brushing once more over the name written in clean, deliberate handwriting, Emily Carter. And there was recognition now, not loud, not immediate, but certain, like a memory returning not through images, but through instinct. He stood up, not abruptly, not forcefully, just rising to his full height with a quiet ease that drew attention without demanding it. One chair turned, then another, eyes shifting not because of noise, but because something in the air had changed. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, a small, precise motion, then took a step forward, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, and as he moved closer, the distance between observer and moment disappeared. He stopped just short of Emily's station, his gaze steady, not on the man who had been speaking, not on the manager who was trying to regain control, but on Emily herself. And for the first time that night, someone in that room looked at her as if she were not part of the background, but the center of it. His voice, when it came, was calm, unhurried, carrying just enough to be heard without effort. "I would like to pay my bill," he said, then paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward the table where the laughter had started, before returning to Emily, under her name. For a second, no one moved, because the sentence did not sound like a confrontation. It sounded like a request, simple, almost ordinary, and that was exactly why it carried weight. The manager blinked, caught off guard. "I am sorry, sir," he said carefully, trying to reassemble control. "I am not sure I understand." Daniel did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself with force. He simply held the check holder between his fingers and placed it gently on the nearest table, aligning it with quiet precision. "Put it under her name," he said again, softer this time, but clearer, as if the room itself needed to adjust to hear it properly. Emily's eyes shifted toward him, just slightly, not wide, not startled, just aware, as if she recognized something in the way he spoke, something familiar in the calm. The manager hesitated, glancing between Daniel and the table that had caused the disturbance, calculating, weighing, uncertain which direction held more risk. "Sir, that is not how we normally process," he began, but the man at table 12 interrupted with a short laugh. "Oh, this is good," he said, leaning forward, interest returning to his tone. "What is this, some kind of statement?" A few of his companions smiled again, relieved that the attention had shifted away from them and back into something entertaining. Daniel finally turned his head toward the table, not quickly, not sharply, just enough for his gaze to settle on the man who had been speaking, and when he did, the room seemed to quiet in a different way, not because of volume, but because of focus. "It is not a statement," Daniel said, his voice steady, almost conversational. "It is a correction." The word landed without force, but it did not need any. The man's smile flickered, not gone, but uncertain now, as if the script he had been following no longer applied. "A correction?" he repeated, a hint of challenge returning. Daniel nodded once, a small, controlled motion. "You asked for proper service," he continued. "You received it." He let the sentence settle, not rushing to fill the silence that followed. "Now you are asking for something else." Another pause, brief, deliberate. "Recognition." The word hung there, quiet, undeniable. The manager shifted his stance, sensing the shift but not fully understanding it. Emily remained still, her hands relaxed now at her sides, her tray resting lightly against her hip. And for the first time since the tension began, she was not the center of scrutiny. She was the center of something else, something steadier. The man at table 12 leaned back again, but the ease was gone, replaced by a stiffness he could not quite hide. "Look," he said, forcing a lightness into his tone. "It was just a joke." Daniel's eyes did not move from him, not sharp, not aggressive, just present. "Jokes are meant to be shared," he replied, not assigned. A few heads turned, not toward the speaker this time, but toward Daniel, as if seeing him for the first time. The weight of his presence no longer quiet, but undeniable. The manager cleared his throat softly, uncertain whether to intervene or step back, and Daniel finally reached into his jacket, not hurried, not dramatic, simply retrieving a card and placing it beside the check holder, his fingers resting there for a brief moment before he looked back at Emily, his voice lowering just slightly, enough that it felt personal even in a crowded room. "Run it under her name," he said. "She earned it." And in that moment, the room did not feel divided anymore. It felt measured, as if something invisible had shifted, not loudly, not forcefully, but permanently. No one reached for the card at first. Not because they did not understand what he had asked, but because something about the moment made them hesitate, as if touching it too quickly would break whatever had just shifted in the room. The manager glanced down at the card, then back at Daniel, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture had changed. Straighter now, more attentive. "Sir," he said quietly, "may I have your name for the receipt?" Daniel's gaze held his for a brief second, then moved past him, returning to Emily, as if the answer was not meant for the manager at all. "It is not necessary," he replied, his tone calm, final, the kind that did not invite follow-up. The manager nodded once, slowly, then picked up the card, his eyes dropping to read it, and that was when the smallest change occurred. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a pause. A fraction longer than normal, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge before relaxing again. He looked up at Daniel, then back at the card, as if confirming something he had not expected to see. "Of course," he said, softer now, almost careful, and stepped away without another word. The man at table 12 noticed the shift immediately, not the card itself, but the reaction to it. The way the manager had stopped pushing back, the way the room no longer felt like it belonged to him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain. "Who are you?" Steady, controlled. She did not rush, did not look overwhelmed. She simply did her job, the same way she had from the beginning, but now the room was watching differently. Not for mistakes, not for entertainment, but for something else, something they had missed before. The manager returned a moment later, the receipt already printed, his movements more deliberate now, more respectful. He handed it to Emily instead of placing it on the table, a small detail, but one that did not go unnoticed. "Whenever you are ready," he said softly, and stepped back. Emily glanced down at the receipt, then at the card, then back up at Daniel. Just for a second, their eyes met, not long, not dramatic, but enough to recognize something unspoken, a quiet understanding that did not need explanation. She nodded once, a small gesture, then turned toward the register, and as she walked away, the space she left behind did not close, it expanded, leaving the man at table 12 sitting in a silence he could not control, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found, because for the first time that night, he was no longer the one being watched, he was the one being seen. Emily did not rush as she reached the register, even though she could feel the weight of the room behind her, not heavy in the way it had been before, but present, attentive, the kind of silence that listened instead of judged. Her fingers moved with practiced precision as she entered the amount, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly in her eyes, steady, focused, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She slid the card through, waited for the confirmation, then printed the receipt, each motion calm, deliberate, controlled, the way someone moved when they understood that dignity was not something given by others, but something carried within. Behind her, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, quiet conversations returning in low tones, chairs shifting slightly, glasses lifted once more, but the earlier energy did not come back. Something had interrupted it, something that could not be undone by noise. At table 12, the man cleared his throat softly, adjusting his jacket as if trying to settle back into a role that no longer fit. "I think this has been blown out of proportion," he said, his voice measured now, careful. But no one responded the way they had before. His companions avoided eye contact. One of them reached for his drink, another glanced toward the window, the subtle signs of distance appearing one by one, because the moment they had shared earlier no longer felt like something to belong to, it felt like something to step away from. Daniel remained where he was, not reclaiming the center of attention, not asserting anything further. His presence no longer needed explanation. It simply existed, grounded, unshaken, as if he had already said everything that mattered. The manager stood a few feet away, watching with a new awareness, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful. He adjusted his tie, then glanced toward Emily, following her movements as she turned back from the register, receipt in hand, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged. She approached Daniel first, not out of obligation, but because that was the order of things. The one who had asked, the one who had waited. She placed the receipt gently in front of him, along with the card, her voice soft but clear. Your payment has been processed. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up at her, his expression the same as before, composed. But there was something else there now, something closer to recognition than observation. Thank you, he said, simple, direct, and then, after a slight pause, for your professionalism. The words were not loud, but they carried, not because of volume, but because of timing, because of everything that had come before them. Emily nodded once, accepting the words without surprise, without deflection, just as fact, then turned toward table 12, not avoiding them, not hesitating, simply continuing her work. Is there anything else I can assist you with? She asked, her tone identical to before, steady, neutral, offering service without surrender. The man looked up at her, and for a moment, he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because whatever he had prepared earlier no longer fit. No, he said finally, quieter now. We are fine. Emily nodded again, a small, controlled gesture, then stepped back, giving them space, the same way she had from the beginning, but now the space felt different. No longer something to take advantage of, but something to respect, and as she moved away, the room did not follow her with judgment. It followed her with something else, something quieter, something earned, because in a place where voices had tried to define her, she had remained unchanged, and in doing so, she had changed the room instead. Daniel did not sit back down immediately, and that alone held the room in a quiet suspension, not because anyone expected more words, but because something about his stillness suggested the moment was not fully complete. His gaze followed Emily as she moved between tables, not intruding, not claiming, simply observing with a kind of attention that felt deliberate, as if he were confirming something he had already decided. The manager approached him carefully, his tone now carrying a different kind of respect. Mr. Whitmore, he said softly, the name landing just loud enough to travel, just quiet enough to feel unintended, and that was when the final shift happened, subtle, but irreversible. A few heads turned, then a few more, recognition spreading not through announcement, but through memory, through association, through the quiet realization that the man who had spoken so little was not just anyone. The man at table 12 froze for a fraction of a second, his expression tightening as the name settled in, not fully understanding at first, but understanding enough. Whitmore, he repeated under his breath, the confidence he had worn earlier now slipping into something less certain. Daniel finally turned toward the manager, acknowledging him with a small nod, not correcting, not confirming, simply allowing the name to exist in the space. The manager straightened slightly, his earlier hesitation replaced by clarity. We appreciate your visit, sir, he said, and stepped back, careful now not to overstep again. Daniel's attention returned to Emily as she approached another table, refilling water, offering a quiet smile, the same composure, the same steady presence, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded, and that, more than anything, seemed to hold his focus. He took a step forward, closing the distance by just enough to speak without raising his voice. Emily, he said, and this time, her name did not sound like a label, it sounded like recognition. She turned toward him, her expression calm, attentive, as if he were simply another guest, nothing more, nothing less. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone professional, consistent. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, not searching, not testing, simply acknowledging. There was a position offered to someone 3 years ago, he said, his voice even, each word measured. Junior legal analyst, Whitmore Group. A brief pause. Would not be more, not from him. The door opened with a gentle chime, a rush of cool evening air slipping briefly into the warm light of the dining room, then it closed again, and just like that, he was gone. But the silence he left behind stayed, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present, like something that needed to be considered. The manager exhaled slowly, as if realizing he had been holding his breath longer than he thought. He adjusted his tie again, then glanced around the room, taking in the subtle changes, the lowered voices, the absence of laughter, the shift in posture, and for the first time that night, he did not rush to restore what had been lost, because he understood that what had been lost was not worth restoring. At table 12, the man sat still, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of his glass, no longer tapping, no longer gesturing, just still. His eyes drifted briefly toward the door Daniel had exited through, then back to the table, then finally, almost reluctantly, toward Emily, who was now clearing another table with the same steady movements as before. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The words he might have used earlier no longer fitting. His companions remained quiet, their earlier confidence replaced by a shared awareness that did not need to be spoken aloud. One of them reached for the check. Another nodded slightly toward Emily when she passed. Small gestures, subtle, but different, the kind that did not erase what had happened, but acknowledged it. Emily continued her work without pause, without change, because for her, nothing essential had shifted. The room had changed, the people had changed, but she had remained the same, and that was the difference. She moved from table to table, refilling glasses, collecting plates, offering quiet smiles, her presence no longer overlooked, no longer background, but centered in a way that did not demand attention, only deserved it. The manager approached her after a moment, his tone softer now, more measured. "Emily," he said, waiting until she looked at him, "you handled that well." The words were simple, but they were not routine. They carried something new, something closer to recognition than instruction. Emily gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied, then returned to her work, not seeking more, not expecting more, because she did not need it. And as the night continued, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, but not its previous state. Something had settled into the space, something quiet, something lasting, not announced, not explained, but felt, because sometimes the loudest shift in a room does not come from what is said, but from what is finally understood, and that understanding does not leave when the door closes, it stays. In the way people look at each other, in the way they choose their words, in the way they remember, long after the moment has passed. The night moved forward the way all nights did, slowly, steadily, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but the truth lingered in the small things, in the quieter voices, in the way people paused just a second longer before speaking, in the way eyes met and then softened instead of dismissed. Emily noticed it without needing to look for it, because when a room changed, it did not announce itself. It revealed itself in behavior, in restraint, in respect that no longer needed to be earned. Twice, she finished clearing the last table near the window, the same one Daniel had occupied, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface where his glass had been, the faint ring of condensation still visible under the soft light. She wiped it clean with a single, practiced motion, leaving nothing behind, just as she had done with everything else that night. No trace, no residue, only quiet order. The manager approached again, slower this time, not with urgency, but with intention. "We are closing in about 30 minutes, he said, his tone gentler than it had been at the start of the shift. "You can take your break early if you want." Emily shook her head slightly. "I will finish my section," she replied, simple, direct, and he nodded, accepting it without question, because he understood now that she did not stay because she had to. She stayed because she chose to. At table 12, the check had been settled. The men stood one by one, gathering their coats, their movements quieter, less certain. The man who had spoken the most earlier hesitated for a moment before stepping toward Emily, his hand adjusting his jacket again. A habit now, something to do with his hands when words no longer came easily. "Miss," he said, and the words sounded different than before, not sharp, not dismissive, just uncertain. Emily turned toward him, her expression the same as always, calm, attentive. "Yes, sir," she replied, and for a brief second, he looked at her as if searching for the version of her he thought he had seen earlier, but it was not there, because it had never been there. "About earlier," he began, then paused, the sentence unfinished. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that whatever he said now would not change what had already been revealed. Emily waited, not impatient, not expectant, just present, giving him the space to finish or not finish, and after a moment, he nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said instead, the words simple, but carrying something different than before, something closer to humility than politeness. Emily gave a small nod in return. "You are welcome," she replied, and that was all. No lesson, no correction, no need to extend the moment beyond what it was, because sometimes the most powerful response was not in what you added, but in what you allowed to remain unspoken. The men left shortly after, the door closing behind them with the same soft chime, but the room did not react this time. It simply continued, steady, composed, as if it had learned something it did not need to repeat. Emily returned to the window one last time, adjusting the silverware, aligning each piece with quiet precision, the reflection of the city lights stretching across the glass beside her, her posture relaxed, her movements unhurried, and for a moment, she allowed herself to be still, not because she needed rest, but because the night had reached its natural end, not in noise, not in resolution, but in understanding, because what had happened was never about who spoke the loudest or who held the most power. It was about who remained unchanged when tested. And in a room full of voices, it was the quiet one who had set the standard, not by force, not by demand, but by simply refusing to become anything less than herself.